Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to Seriously Now. I'm Lex Carline, and here we talk about all the things. Now, I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. We've just had our election here in the UK, and now we have PM Keir Starmer. Can't say I'm overly joyed about that one, but didn't really want the Tories either, so not that our votes really count, but we'll get on to that another day, shall we? Cynicism back in the box. Away, shoo, shoo, shoo. So today, we're going to go back to the 1970s, which is one of the many decades that I wish I could have experienced firsthand. Which one would you choose to go back to? Let me know. On October the 11th, 1973, in a place called Pascagoula in Mississippi, two fishermen, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker Jr., claimed that they had been paralysed and taken on board a UFO by strange beings. Now, over the years, their claimed encounter has divided opinions, which I'm sure you can imagine, and there are those who completely believe the tale, and those that think it's nothing more than a shared hallucination or simply a barefaced lie. And whilst Hickson talked frequently over the years about the encounter, Parker kept a much lower profile until much later on in life, and we will hear from both of their accounts today. In October of 2002, in yet another interview, Hickson gave another highly detailed account of their event to the Clarion Ledger columnist Billy Watkins. And he even revealed something that he had never before talked about publicly, and that is that he believes that whatever or whoever took the two men aboard, the aircraft, UFO, whatever you want to call it that night, has kept tabs on him. And he thinks that they know where he is at all times because too many strange things have happened. I don't know whether that would be comforting or unsettling. So what exactly did happen that night? Well, first we're going to hear from Charles Hickson. Now, Hickson says that Parker was working for him at a Walker's shipyard and said he'd been doing a good job, bless him. Both Calvin and his brother had sort of grown up with Hickson's eldest boy, Eddie, and so some evenings after work they'd all go fishing together. Nothing out of the ordinary there. And the day in question, he says they finished work at about 4 o'clock and then they stopped by his house to get their fishing tackle. Went and got some shrimp for bait and then tried several places but hadn't actually caught anything. So far, just a pretty standard, wholesome evening. Hickson then told Parker that there was one more place that he wanted to try, and if nothing was there, no bites, then they'd give up and just go home. So they went towards Ingalls and started fishing off a pier. Sitting there for a while, they finally got a bite. And just as he was reeling it in, he started hearing a hissing sound. He said it sounded like steam coming out of a pipe. So naturally, you look round to investigate what's happening and see what it is, and he said he was just startled. There was something hovering 2 or 3 feet above the ground, which was probably no more than 10 or 15 yards in front of them. He said there were 2 blue flashing lights on the top part of the end that was towards them, and he couldn't really tell if it was round or oblong, but he could see a little dome on top. But he said he couldn't see all the way around the object, so couldn't really tell for sure how big it was. I think just something floating right in front of you with blue flashing lights that didn't look like anything you'd ever seen before would be enough, wouldn't it? He says he jumped to his feet, looked over at Parker, and said he looked plumb strange. To quote directly, never heard that expression before, plumb strange. He said then the door opened on the craft and this brilliant light came out of it. He couldn't figure out what in the world was happening. To be fair, I don't think I would either. Now, he says he's known fear. He even fought 20 months in hand-to-hand combat in Korea. Oh, excuse my stomach, have you heard that? And the only thing he's scared of is a snake. He'll run from a snake. But this, he says, just wasn't normal. Then all of a sudden, out of this bright light, these 3 beings began coming out of the door, looking like they had elephant skin, wrinkled, really, really wrinkled, he says, and triangle-shaped ears that had to be some sort of antennas. I'm guessing that wasn't his initial thought, although I don't know, but that seems like something you would have come to later. Now, he says these things were like some sort of robot, and they didn't touch the ground, they just kind of hovered. They moved out right beside him and Parker, and he says that neither of them could move. He says 2 of them came right behind him, took him under each arm, and grabbed him. And when they grabbed him, he seemed to rise up to their height. He said they weren't as tall as me, but they sort of had me in a leaning position, if you can imagine that. He says he saw Calvin Parker turn limp when one took hold of them, and Parker did later admit that he'd fainted. Can't say I blame him. They were taken through the doorway, and he was taken into the middle of a room, but he could no longer see Parker. And he said there was nothing really in there, just this brilliant glow, and the only thing he could move was his eyes. Freaky would that be? Only being able to move your eyes. Ooh, no thank you. It's like some kind of locked-in syndrome. He says that once they let go of him, he wasn't touching anything, no bed or anything like that. He was just kind of floating there. That does sound kind of fun, not going to lie. I'd love to just be able to float around my room. But maybe in this circumstance, maybe not so much. And Hickson said that all he could think about was, what are they going to do with us? Figuring that they would just fly away with the 2 men and neither of them would see their families again. Which, legitimate concern. He says he didn't see the robots, as he called them, for a while. And then an eyeball about the size of a football came out of the wall. This eyeball moved right up to his face, and he said he saw dials and gadgets moving around. It went behind him, then over him, and then disappeared back into the wall. He says he was just about out of his mind and thought that they were going to kill him. That people would just think that they'd fallen off into the river and drowned, and nobody would ever even think about alien abduction or anything like this. He said after a long time, or what felt like a long time, but really thinks was only a few minutes, the robots carried them back outside. Didn't throw them down, eased them down gently, so put them back nicely where they found them. And he says when he did actually touch the floor, he fell to the ground because his legs were just so weak. Parker was also standing there, staring out at the water, and Hickson believes that he was in shock. And he says, I've seen men in shock, and if you don't do something pretty quickly, they die. So he started going over to where he was, to where Parker was, seeing the craft leave with the blue lights on again. And once he actually got to Parker, he had to slap him a couple of times to get him to say something. And when he did speak, all he said was, Charlie, what in the world was that? And Hickson said he replied, Son, I don't know, but they didn't kill us. Which, always a bonus, well, yeah, always a bonus, I suppose. Now, as they drove away in Parker's vehicle, they both agreed not to tell anyone about the incident, because naturally people were just going to think they were crazy, weren't they? As much as I want to believe, I probably would have been a bit sceptical to start with. But then, what do we know? On the grand scheme of things, what do we really know? But Hickson said he thought about it some more, and then decided, well, what if this is actually a threat to our country? What if it's not aliens? What if it's another country, spies, something like that? So he said that's when he decided to call Kessler, which is an Air Force base in Biloxi. And the person who answered the phone at Kessler, you know what I'm trying to say, said that unfortunately they don't investigate UFOs, and instead suggested that they call the sheriff's department. So that's what they did. And Hickson spoke to Glenn Ryder. Now, as Ryder recalls, Hickson said to him, Now I want to tell you something, but you've got to promise not to laugh. And Ryder said that he was about to finish work and he was a little bit irritated by this. And so he said, if you want to tell me something, then just tell me. And again, Hickson asked him to promise not to laugh. So Ryder promised. And that's when Hickson said, I just got picked up by a UFO. And so naturally, as most of us probably would, Ryder started laughing. Hickson got really upset, so Ryder apologized and asked him to continue. It was then that Ryder realized that Hickson was actually being dead serious. So Ryder convinced the 2 men to drive to the sheriff's office, and that's when he called Jackson County Sheriff Fred Diamond, who sadly is no longer with us, and asked him to join him for questioning. I bet they were having a right laugh behind the scenes. Oh, we've got 2 loons coming in. Now, Ryder remembers them walking in, and Charlie Hickson was straight up about the fact that he'd had a drink, saying that he'd had to do something to try and calm his nerves. And Parker was very fidgety, and he looked like he was about to crawl up the walls, which, If you've really just seen that, then I can imagine being a bit fidgety and needing something to settle your nerves, or a lot of somethings. Now, when Hickson and Parker told the two officers what had happened, Ryder did admit that they struggled to keep a straight face. And so the two officers had a little bit of a sneaky plan to try and find out the truth. So they kept a tape recorder in the top drawer of the desk, and being a small office, it would pick up everything. So when Hickson and Parker needed the toilet, the officers let them go and turned the recorder on to then leave them alone in the room for a little while. Now, the plan that they had was to catch the two men out about how it was a joke and, oh, we fooled them, look at us, we got them, woohoo. But that's not exactly what happened. So the transcript from the hidden recorder shows the two men talking about how they're going to need sleeping pills or something like that to go to bed because they're feeling half crazy, and talking about when they came out of the spaceship, and Parker talking about how he couldn't move his arms, like he just stepped on a quote, like I just stepped on a damn rattlesnake. And they basically just went back and forth about how they'd not seen anything like that before in their lives, how they don't know how it opened up, the door opening magically, any of it. The fact that he was paralyzed with fear, that he passed out, and apparently Parker said that he never passes out. And when Hickson leaves the room and Parker is left alone, Parker is heard saying, "It's hard to believe. Oh God, it's awful. I know there's a God up there." And then Parker continues to pray, but his words are inaudible, unfortunately. So that backfired on the police officers, didn't it? Got them thinking, oh, hang on a minute, they're not just joking. And when Hickson got home, he did tell his wife Blanche what had happened as well, and obviously where he'd been. And she said that she was just like everybody else who had a really hard time believing it. But about 3 or 4 hours later, she knew that something was actually wrong, because her husband was up all night sweating. She was wiping it off him. He jumped straight up in the bed. She said he was absolutely scared to death. But Charlie Hickson still went to work the next morning. He said he had to get his men going, but as soon as he got into his office, the phone rang, and it was a reporter from Jackson who was asking what happened the night before. Hickson says he just slung the phone down. "Not talking to you. No, thank you." Now, Officer Diamond called a little bit later on, just to let Hickson know that word had spread and that his office was flooded with reporters. So he asked Hickson to go over and talk to them again, and he said he wasn't going anywhere. He then took 2 weeks off work, hoping that everything would die down. It didn't. So officials at Keesler, remember the Air Force Base, interviewed him and Parker. Reporters and astronomers were coming to his house, begging for details. Why can't we leave people alone? Don't harass people at their homes. No, that's just asshole behaviour. But Charlie Hickson said that it actually got to the point where he decided, you know what? Everybody knows about it. They've all heard the story, or bits of the story, so I might as well tell them what's happened. And he did relay that to Parker. So they were all over national news and all the famous talk shows. They did the Dick Cavett, the Mike Douglas, the Tonight Show. And then something actually surprised Hickson. He said nobody was laughing at us. At least not to our face. I never took any ridicule, and neither did my children at school. Which, given the nature of people, I'm very shocked at as well. Pleasantly shocked, though, so that's good. Charlie Hickson became friends with Alan Hynek, who's actually an astronomer at the Northwestern University and one of the world's leading UFO investigators at the time. Kind of handy. And it was Hynek that convinced Hickson to actually undergo hypnosis, because he wasn't sure at first, but ended up actually doing it several times. And during each session... Why can't I word today? During each session, his story was basically the same. Although he did say that one of the times he was under deep hypnosis, he discovered a suppressed memory that he said still gives him chills, and that was that there were people living on the spaceship. Living beings in another compartment, and they didn't come into where the two men were, but they looked very human-like, which is a bit freaky. And he said that the only thing that he could figure out about it was that they couldn't live in our atmosphere. So the robots come out and then carry us inside for them. Now, the Pascagoula incident was not the first, nor the last, reported abduction. The first documented case involved Barney and Betty Hill, and they said they were taken aboard an alien UFO craft in 1961 whilst they were driving in New Hampshire. So Hickson actually visited Betty Hill in Boston a few months after his encounter. Sadly, her husband had died, but she wanted to try and figure out if it could have been the same craft. And sadly, from what she described to Hickson, it didn't seem so. But how frickin' cool would that have been to know that not only had they been here, but they'd been here more than once? Also kind of freaky, but we know we can't be alone out there, unless the Simpsons have got it right and we're all living under a glass bubble. At this point, I really don't think that would surprise many of us either. So, where are we? Peter Davenport, the director of the National UFO Reporting Center in Seattle, has actually studied both the Hill and the Pascagoula cases extensively. And he said it was actually the Pascagoula case that played the crucial role in convincing his predecessor, Robert Gribble, to set up the centre. He said that cases like Hickson and Parker's made him realise that the need for a centralised place where people could report all types of unusual, UFOs, alien encounters. What are they calling it? It's not UFO as well. It's the UAPs, unexplained aerial phenomena or something, I think it is. But yes, they need somewhere centralised like that so they could report it all, because otherwise it's just a bit here and a bit there and not so easy to track, look for patterns, similarities, all that jazz. Rambling, sorry. Now, Peter Davenport does understand that many people believe UFOs are about as real as the Tooth Fairy or Father Christmas. But clearly, he's not one of them. When he was just 6 years old, he remembers witnessing a bright red object about the size of a full moon, and it was just hovering like a traffic signal in the sky above a drive-in theatre in St. Louis. Or St. Louis. Don't come for me. In a drive-in theatre. He said people were getting out of their cars and actually pointing and running towards it, but in a matter of seconds, it accelerated and poof, gone. He says his father saw it with binoculars from the airport tower where he worked, and he always thought it was strange that his dad never cared to talk about it. Take from that what you will. Now, given his extensive knowledge, Davenport can cite numerous inexplicable cases, including the Phoenix Lights of 1997, where tens of thousands of people witnessed objects acting in an utterly bizarre fashion over Arizona. He says that the objects hovered, flew at supersonic speed through the airspace of at least 3 major airports. That's quite a big one, really. And then he says 5 years prior to this article, prestigious people within the US government requested a meeting with him in Washington. Now, they've asked not to be identified, funnily enough, and they were also 32 minutes late to the meeting. Precise. But when they got there, they opened the meeting by saying that they know UFOs are real, and that also they appear to be sophisticated crafts under intelligent control, which I'd say that goes without saying if they've got the technology to come here, but we can't even get past the moon. Yeah. And I mean with people on board before you say we've sent satellites to Mars and stuff. I mean with people. But they also, the government officials, said that they are actually worried about the UFOs. So for Peter Davenport, that confirmed everything that he'd suspected up until that point. So I don't think I'm crazy. I don't think I'm dumb. And I believe that UFO phenomena is real. In my personal opinion, obviously you're entitled to yours, but I think to write off any life being out there just because, oh no, it can't possibly be out there, is asinine. And also, if the universe is this big and there's nothing else out there but us, what a fucking waste, to be quite honest. Now, somebody else who was high up in the US government, John Podesta, who was President Clinton's former White House chief of staff, said that he believed in UFOs and actually set about a petition to gain access to secret government records about them. He said it's time to provide scientists with data that will assist in determining the real nature of this phenomenon. Well, wasn't that long, was it last year, the year before, they finally admitted that they've got aliens, but that was to distract us from something else, wasn't it? So, slowly getting there. Now, the night in 1973 wasn't actually Charles Hickson's only extraterrestrial encounter. He said that on Mother's Day in 1974, so not that long after, he was riding back from a family get-together in Jones County with his wife, their youngest son Curtis, and their daughter Sheila, and the man that she was married to, her husband at the time. He said it was almost midnight, and he kept noticing a light back behind us. So he nudged Sheila, who was sitting on the front seat next to him, and said, look out the window and see if that's not following us. Because that's always creepy at night when you think you're being followed. That's bad enough when it might be a human. Never mind a human. Well, now we go into the man or the bear. Let's not go there. He said Sheila looked out the window and just froze to the spot. Then his wife noticed it and started screaming. Just seconds later, the saucer-shaped craft was hovering around about 150 feet above and to the right of the car. Now, Sheila said that she saw it with her own eyes and that her mother was so scared. Blanche herself said it was terrifying to see, and it affected her really, really badly. They even stopped the car because Charles wanted to get out, but she wouldn't let him. She said they were all grabbing hold of him and making sure that he did not get out of the car. Probably worried that if they took him again, they wouldn't bring him back this time. The craft hovered there for a little while and then just disappeared. In 1983, Charles Hickson wrote a book, UFO, Contact at Pascagoula, and it says that encounter on Mother's Day wasn't even his first encounter since the initial one. He'd been squirrel hunting in February of 1974 and knelt down beside a tree to eat a sandwich. He said through the brush he could see part of a craft was visible, and then he heard a voice, like a radio signal or something inside his head. So they've got telepathic powers too. And the voice said, "Tell people we mean you no harm. You have endured. You have been chosen. There is no need for fear. Your world needs help. We will help before it is too late. You are not prepared to understand. We will return again soon." He said he picked up his gun and went straight home. I think I'd have done the same. Run away! He did say that the same voice with the same message came back to him about a month later, but this time he was in his backyard, and he said since then all the fear is gone. Even to the point that he says that he wants to go to their world, wherever that is. And he said he didn't think that they would carry him if they couldn't bring him back. And so if they ever decide to destroy this world, they might save a few of the people, and I think I'd like to be one of those. That's a really nice sentiment. Although now I've got like Independence Day in my head where they're just kind of beaming up a few people before they start trying to completely annihilate the planet. But then there's the theory that we were left here by aliens in the first place, but we'll do that another day. So, this is where it gets a bit weirder. If alien abductions can get weirder, here we go. Charles Hickson pulls out several x-rays and shows them to the reporter. He points specifically to a little mole-looking thing behind his right eye. He thinks that the robots or whoever abducted him that night put something there. They've implanted something in him. Now, he's been to the hospital in New Orleans twice, the VA hospital in New Orleans twice, been to a cancer doctor at Tulane University, but nobody can figure out what it is. So Hickson thinks that that is actually a tracking device, and that's how they always know where he is. So it doesn't hurt, doesn't affect his vision, doesn't really do anything, it's just there. And it showed up when they were taking pictures of the arteries in his neck. Bizarre. Now, as we said earlier, Calvin Parker was a lot less vocal about that night in 1973, and as Hickson says, it really messed him up. He was so young at the time and he just couldn't handle it. And unfortunately, at one point, Parker was actually briefly hospitalised after a breakdown about the abduction. Now, in 1993, in an interview with the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Parker actually said that he was convinced it was demons that had been sent directly from Satan who visited them that night. Well, I don't really know what to say there. That's kind of... If they were demons sent directly from Satan, would you have been treated so nicely? Would you have been treated so well? Would they have left you alive? So at the time of the 2002 interview, Beverly Parker, who was Calvin's stepmother, said that they hadn't heard from him for a while, sort of the last couple of months or so, but the last thing she knew, he was working in construction somewhere in North Carolina and was doing pretty good, but that the UFO incident is something he just wouldn't talk about anymore. However, events in Parker's life actually resulted in him feeling like he needed to tell his story, which he did in his 2018 book, Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, My Story. And in an interview also in 2018, Parker talked about that night. He also said that he'd noticed blue lights reflecting off the water and that his initial thought was that the police had turned up to tell the two fishermen that they needed to leave the property. So were they fishing somewhere they shouldn't have been? However, when he realised that the lights were coming from a craft like he'd never seen, he quickly changed his mind. He said it was a big light coming out of the clouds and it was blinding. Now, it was hard to tell because the lights were so bright, but it looked like it was the shape of a football. So in the UK, we're going rugby ball rather than soccer ball. And he said that he thought it was, as an estimate, around 80 foot in length, and it made very, very little noise, just sort of a slight hissing. Parker said that 3 legless creatures had floated from the craft. One had no neck with grey wrinkled skin, so the elephant skin that Hickson mentioned. Another had a neck and appeared more feminine, and he described their hands as being shaped like mittens or crab claws. Now, as we know, the two men ultimately decided that they needed to notify the authorities, but once in the interview room, Parker stayed silent. And after the recording of the two men resurfaced, which was around about the time of the COVID pandemic, Parker listened to it and said that he actually regretted his silence, wishing that he'd told the sheriffs everything that night as well. Now, obviously, there were those who firmly believed that the two men did encounter extraterrestrial life that night, and then there are those who aren't so convinced. Philip J. Klass, who is a renowned UFO skeptic, noted discrepancies in Hickson's account, such as he once referred to the beings as having a hole for a mouth and then a slit. Now, I'm not saying that they definitely did see something, I'm not saying that they didn't, but if that's the discrepancy you're going with, a hole to a slit after something quite traumatic, or really friggin' traumatic, that seems like a bit of a reach to me. Now, Klass also pointed, and this is a fair point, to the inexperienced polygraph operator who did conduct the lie detector test that Hickson passed, and his refusal to take another that was conducted, or that would have been conducted, by an expert police examiner. Now, according to the Clarion Ledger, Hickson has actually apparently passed several tests. Klass also said that other evidence, such as Hickson once being fired from a job because he'd improperly obtained money from employees who were under his supervision, led to the conclusion that it was all a hoax. Again, reaching. Or, sorry, in my opinion, Klass seems to be reaching, just to discredit them, just because, whatever reason. No, UFOs aren't real, so you can't have seen anything, and I'll find anything, even if it's not completely relevant, to make sure that... Anyway, it was this sort of ridicule? It was this sort of ridicule that stopped Maria Blair from coming forward for 45 years. 45 years. She said that very same night in October 1973, she was near the river waiting for her husband Jerry to leave on a boat for work. He'd fallen asleep, and she saw a strange blue light streaking back and forth. Didn't really think anything of it until the next day when she heard about Hickson and Parker's story. But much like they'd discussed, she just thought people would think that she was crazy. I mean, I don't really blame her. But in 2019, she finally got the courage to come forward, stating that she wanted to give validation to Parker and Hickson. It's never too late to do the right thing, guys. Never too late. And in June of that year, a marker was unveiled at the alleged abduction site, calling it one of the best documented cases of alien abduction. Now, unfortunately, Charles Hickson died in 2011 at the age of 80, so he didn't get to see the unveiling. But Parker, his family, and some of Hickson's were there, and Parker said it meant so much to be finally recognised after all the years of ridicule. Which, I imagine it would be. And just a shame that Hickson didn't get to see it. So, what do you guys think? Are you a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between? Myself? Oh, I definitely want to believe. And I do firmly believe that we are not alone. So, yeah, I'm going to lean on the yes side of the fence, I think, for this one. If you made it to the end, first of all, thank you very much for sticking it out with me. As always, you can find me on the socials at Seriously Now Pod, and our email address for content requests, feedback, any Seriously You stories, your own tales of the weird and wonderful. The email is seriouslynowpod@gmail.com, and if you fancy donating to the channel, our PayPal is the same, and it would be greatly appreciated. I will look at some sort of Patreon program in the near future, and maybe even some merch if you guys want that too, let me know. But until next time, where we will be talking about the darker side of fairies, just make sure you guys stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.